Welcome back to our study of the book of Genesis. Today, we are in Genesis chapter 25. There's a lot that happens in this chapter. I was looking over it before I got started. There is a whole lot going on in this chapter, so hop on board. We've got a lot of ground to cover, and there's a lot of changes that are going to happen in this chapter. First of all, in the first 6 verses, after Sarah had died, Abraham marries another wife, takes another wife, and has children with her. The text says that Abraham again took a wife, and her name was Keturah, and she bore him Zimran, Jokshan, Medan, Midian, Ishbak, and Shua. Jokshan begot Sheba and Dedan, and the sons of Dedan were Ashurim, Letshuim, and Lumiam, and the sons of Midian were Ephah, Epher, Hanak, Abidah, and Eldah. All these were the children of Keturah. And Abraham gave all that he had to Isaac. But Abraham gave gifts to the sons of the concubine, which Abraham had. And while he was still living, he sent them eastward, away from Isaac his son, to the country of the east. So, we read here a list of the sons of Abraham through Keturah. Michael Whitworth, in his book on Genesis, The Epic of God, wrote that of these sons, nothing is known about Jokshan, but it's a different story concerning his son. Sheba became a nation in southwest Arabia, and you might remember a queen of Sheba visiting Jerusalem during the reign of Solomon in 1 Kings chapter 10. Now also, Sheba's brother Dedan also settled in Arabia. The place known as Dedan was an important commercial settlement located at one of the major oases in northwest Arabia. So, the children of Keturah became fairly powerful. Midian is also a name you probably recognize. Midian is the most mentioned one throughout the Old Testament. For example, later in this book, in Genesis 37, Joseph's brothers sell him to Midianite traders. Not traitors, as in they have betrayed their country, but traders, as in they are merchants. In Exodus 3, Moses marries into Jethro's family, Jethro was the priest of Midian. Later on in Numbers chapter 22, 25, and 31, we read about the Midianites and the Moabites plotting against Israel before they enter into the land of Canaan. And then in the book of Judges, good old Gideon, the Midianites oppress Israel during the days of Gideon, one of the judges during that period of Israel's history. So Midian is going to pop up several other times throughout the Old Testament. Now, Shua is likely the forefather of one of Job's friends, Bildad the Shuhite in Job 2, verse 11, probably a descendant of this Shua. So, we know a little bit about some of these descendants of Keturah. Now, technically, Abraham owed these sons nothing at all, since Isaac was the son of promise, and Abraham gave all that he had to Isaac. So Abraham giving them gifts was very generous. We repeatedly see Abraham using his possessions in a very kind and in a very generous way, as we have studied his life. And he sends them away because of his trust in the promise of God through Isaac. This land is going to be given to Isaac, so I'm going to send everyone away from him and from this land. Now, Genesis 25, verse 7 through 11, after all of that, we read about the death of Abraham. It says, "This is the sum of the years of Abraham's life which he lived, 175 years. Then Abraham breathed his last and died in a good old age, an old man and full of years, and was gathered to his people. And his sons Isaac and Ishmael buried him in the cave of Machpelah, which is before Mamre, in the field of Ephron, the son of Zohar the Hittite, the field which Abraham purchased from the sons of Heth. There Abraham was buried, and Sarah his wife. And it came to pass, after the death of Abraham, that God blessed his son Isaac, and Isaac dwelt at Beer-lahai-roi." So Abraham, the text says, lived a long, happy, contented life. He lived his life trusting in the promise of God, even though he never received it in his lifetime, as one of those like Hebrews 11, verse 39 through verse 40 points out. He looked to the promises of God, although in his lifetime he never actually saw it. Now, apparently, Isaac and Ishmael had remained in touch over the years, and they were on good enough terms to bury their father together. Now, only Isaac and Ishmael here are mentioned, and they bury Abraham in the land that God had promised to his descendants. There is faith in the promises of God shown here on the part of both Isaac and Ishmael. And Isaac then left the Negeb, and he moved to Beer Lahai Roi, which is where God heard and answered Hagar's prayer when she was running away from Sarah, all the way back in Genesis chapter 16, verse 14. And the name of that place meant, "You are the God who sees." So, after the death of his father, Isaac moves to the place which Hagar called, "You are the God who sees." So Isaac is very interested in being, if you will, after the death of his mother, after the death of his father, being in a place where he knows, "God, you see me." Something I think we can all relate to and understand when we go through times of grief and times of difficulty in our life. Now, after the death of Abraham, the text very quickly summarizes the life and the family of Ishmael in Genesis 25, verse 12 through 18. It says, "Now this is the genealogy of Ishmael, Abraham's son, whom Hagar the Egyptian, Sarah's maidservant, bore to Abraham. And these are the names of the sons of Ishmael, by their names according to their generations. The firstborn of Ishmael was Nebajoth, then Kedar, Abil, Mibsam, Mishma, Duma, Massa, Hadar, Tema, Jeter, Naphish, and Kedemah. These were the sons of Ishmael, and these were their names by their towns and their settlements, 12 princes according to their nations. These were the years of the life of Ishmael, 137 years, and he breathed his last and died and was gathered to his people. They dwelt from Havilah as far as Shur, which is east of Egypt as you go toward Assyria. That's where Ishmael and his family and these people lived. He died in the presence of all his brethren." So what we learn here is that God kept his promise to Hagar all the way back in Genesis 21, verse 18, that Ishmael would become a great nation. This passage shows, hey, God did exactly what he said he would do. Ishmael, his family became a great and powerful nation. In fact, it says many nations and princes came from him. Most of Ishmael's family settled in today what we know as what we call the Sinai and Arabian Peninsula. So Saudi Arabia, kind of that area, that's where Ishmael's family settles. So we read about the death of Abraham. We read about his other children through Keturah. We read about the life and the family of Ishmael. And now, Genesis 25, verse 19 through 28, we read about the birth of Isaac and Rebekah's children, Esau and Jacob. This is the genealogy of Isaac, Abraham's son. Abraham begot Isaac. Isaac was 40 years old when he took Rebekah as wife, the daughter of Bethuel the Syrian of Paddan Aram, the sister of Laban the Syrian. Now Isaac pleaded with the Lord for his wife because she was barren, and the Lord granted his pleas, and Rebekah, his wife, conceived. But the children struggled together within her, and she said, "If all is well, then why am I like this?" So she went to inquire of the Lord. And the Lord said to her, "Two nations are in your womb. Two peoples shall be separated from your body. One people shall be stronger than the other, and the older shall serve the younger." So we know about the faith of Abraham. Half of what we've read so far, Genesis 12, pretty much through Genesis 25, has been about Abraham and his journey of faith. We know about the faith of Abraham, but now he's died. So what will Isaac do? What will he do? Will he too live by faith? We know about how Sarah, her faith grew, but what about Rebekah? So now the scene shifts from Abraham and Sarah now to Isaac and Rebekah. What about their faith? Will they also, like Abraham and Sarah, live by faith? And we read about a problem. Rebekah was barren. She could not have children. So the question that would have been going through Isaac's head perhaps was, had Isaac married the right girl? Is this a sign of God's disapproval of this marriage? Certainly not. I don't know if that's what Isaac would have thought, but that thought might have popped up in his head. It's certainly maybe in other people's heads. Maybe this is not something that God is pleased with. That's why they've had no children. But Isaac's response to this challenge of his faith was simply to pray or plead with the Lord for his wife. His father, Abraham, and his son, Jacob, often complicated matters by taking the situation into their own hands. And Isaac is also going to make that same mistake, but at least not in this case. He turns to God and pleads with God, and his prayer was consistent with the will of God. He knew the promise of God, Genesis 12, 1 through 3. We too ought to pray for things consistent with God's will, 1 John 5, verse 14. Isaac desired God's answer so that God could continue to be faithful to his covenant promises. And the Lord hears and answers the prayer of Isaac. However, Rebekah becomes concerned about the struggle that's happening in her womb. The same word, Hebrew word for struggle, is used in Judges 9, verse 53, to describe a man's skull being crushed, and then in Ecclesiastes 12, verse 6, to describe a bowl and a wheel being broken. So, struggle, it's more the idea of a struggling to the extent of like bones being crushed together and smashed together. There was more to this struggle than strong kicks from the children. It was we might say, a knockdown, drag-out struggle happening between the two boys in her womb. So Rebekah also goes to the Lord with her concerns, and God reveals why the struggle is taking place. 2 nations, he says, are in her womb. One would be stronger, and I think that's referring to Esau, but the older, reference to Esau, the stronger, would end up serving the younger. So back to the text now. So when her days were fulfilled for her to give birth, indeed, there were twins in her womb. And the first came out red. He was like a hairy garment all over, so they called his name Esau. Afterward, his brother came out, and his hand took hold of Esau's heel. So his name was called Jacob. Isaac was 60 years old when she bore them. So the boys grew, and Isaac was a skillful hunter, a man of the field, but Jacob was a mild man, dwelling in tents. And Isaac loved Esau because he ate of his game, but Rebekah loved Jacob. Esau had a ruddy complexion like David, 1 Samuel 16, verse 12. He was also very hairy, which is going to be an important detail later on in Genesis. Jacob, when he's born, he comes out, he grabs his brother's heel, which earns him his name Jacob, or supplanter, or heel grabber. His name would take on new meaning in the future as well. Now, Isaac was 60 years old when these boys were born. He and Rebekah had married, Genesis 25, verse 20 said, when he was 40. So, he had prayed for his wife to have children for 20 years. Some of you listening to this, I know that you may have had trouble having children. Can you imagine? This was not just, a year or two. For 20 years, Isaac and Rebekah are trying to have children. Isaac is pleading with God for Rebekah, his wife. Imagine then what that 20 years was like, and imagine then what this birth was like, what a joyful occasion it was. And as the boys grew up, they could not have been more different, as children tend to be. I have 3 children, and it is amazing to me how they have grown up in the same house with the same 2 parents, and all 3 of them are so very different. It's always an amazing thing. No different with Jacob and Esau. 2 boys born twins, totally different. Esau was an outdoorsman and a skilled hunter, while Jacob was a mild or a quiet man, which means that he was more civilized or cultured. If you want to think about them as maybe if you were to put them in a high school scene today, Esau would have been the center of attention. He would have been the captain of the football team. He would have been very popular. He's the guy that, is posting pictures on social media. He's always going hunting. He's got the big beard, the rugged mountain man, the lumberjack, the man's man, big guy. That's who Esau was. That's who he would have been. Jacob, though, on the other hand, he would have been the bookworm. He would have been very intelligent. He would have known how to apply book knowledge to real life. If you were wanting to win a football game, or if you were wanting to go on a hunt and kill something for food, you'd want Esau. On the other hand, if you had this complex problem you needed to solve and you needed some input, you would go to Jacob. Very different boys, as they tend to be. We also, though, learn some details here in our text that were going to cause problems. Isaac and Rebekah had favorites. Isaac loved Esau because of the food that he caught, while Rebekah loved Jacob. Now, as Genesis chapter 25 draws to a close, we learn about an event that is going to, at least for Esau and really for Jacob, this event kind of sets the stage for everything that's to come. And it's when Esau sells his birthright in Genesis 25, verse 29 through 34. It says, "Now Jacob cooked a stew, and Esau came in from the field, and he was weary. And Esau said to Jacob, 'Please feed me with that same red stew, for I am weary, I'm worn out.' Therefore his name was called Edom. But Jacob said, 'Sell me your birthright as of this day.' And Esau said, 'Look, I'm about to die, so what is this birthright to me?' And then Jacob said, 'Swear to me as of this day.' So he swore to him and sold his birthright to Jacob. And Jacob gave Esau bread and stew of lentils. Then he ate and drank, arose and went his way. Thus Esau despised his birthright." The parents' favoritism and this scene lay the foundation for Jacob and Esau's relationship. So Jacob is cooking, and Esau comes in exhausted from hunting. And Esau asks for some of the red stew that Jacob's been making, which earns Esau his name Edom, which means red. While Esau was red at birth, this wasn't the red instance that earned Esau the name Edom. The name Edom came from this request, this scene. Edom was a reminder of this moment. Now, so far in Genesis, think about the importance of changing someone's name. Abraham and Sarah's name, they were changed, their names were changed to reflect the promise of God. Later on in Genesis 32, we're going to see Jacob's name changed to Israel after his struggle with God and men. But Esau, he's called Edom because of this decision that he makes. Not a good name change. Jacob refuses to just give this stew to Esau. He says, "Sell me your birthright today." Jacob's actions and mentality were very far removed from his grandfather's hospitality. Remember back in Genesis chapter 18. Jacob is not very much like Abraham. And Esau responds, "Well, I'm going to die if I don't eat, so why not?" While he probably was not close to dying, he was exhausted and extremely hungry. This was a hunt that may have taken days, and he had likely traveled many miles with little to eat. So a lot of times people say Esau wasn't dying. Probably not. But realize that at the very least he's been out hunting all day and has eaten nothing. Perhaps he's traveled many miles over multiple days with very little to eat. So he is in a vulnerable state. But Esau swears to Jacob, and Jacob gives him something to eat. And the phrase, "Thus Esau despised his birthright," that is a significant phrase. In the narrative sections of Scripture, like we're in Genesis, someone's actions are not usually called out as being wrong or sinful. Now, sin certainly occurs, but the writer doesn't usually say, "Hey, by the way, such and such is sinful." It just, the narrative says, "Hey, here's what happened." And so, in this case, Moses calls attention to the sinfulness and the foolishness of Esau, while he doesn't say anything about the obvious sinful actions of Jacob. Now, why does he do that? Because here, Esau's decision is important in the biblical narrative and what's going to happen later in the book of Genesis. The birthright was a very precious thing to the firstborn son. Esau could expect to inherit the largest portion of his father's wealth, and his father was tremendously wealthy. Remember, Abraham's wealth was given to Isaac, and we remember how wealthy Abraham was. Deuteronomy 21, verse 17, gave instructions on how to divide the inheritance. The firstborn was the one with the birthright. The firstborn, in this case was Esau, was entitled to 2 portions of the inheritance. And so if this is the way that Isaac divided his estate, Esau had at least 2/3 coming his way. Of course, the birthright child also could receive the entire estate, or 98% of the estate, like Abraham did with Isaac. Genesis 25, verse 5. Everything goes to Isaac except for a few small gifts that are given to the other children. That could have been what Isaac was going to do with Esau. So at the very least, Esau probably has 2/3 of the estate coming his way, perhaps as much as basically all of it. What Esau does is totally unheard of in all literature preserved from this time in history. Esau becomes an example to everyone who would sacrifice a future blessing from God to satisfy here and now desires. Hebrews 12, verse 16 through 17. On this, Michael Whitworth wrote, "Sexual temptation specifically appeals to the hunger of the flesh, persuading us to forget about the glory and honor of an undefiled marriage bed," Hebrews 13:4. But as was the case for Esau, the trade-off is never worth it and only leads to many years, if not a lifetime, of heartache. And so Genesis 25, it begins with Abraham marrying, his death, what happens with Ishmael, the birth of Jacob and Esau, and then this event that takes place between Jacob and Esau that sort of sets up everything that's coming after this. Now let's think about a couple of lessons from Genesis chapter 25. When we face difficulties and problems in our life, let us take those concerns before God. He continues to care for us, Peter wrote in 1 Peter 5, verse 6 and 7. We notice the problems earlier in this book, in Genesis, that developed for Abraham and Sarah because they relied on themselves instead of relying on God. We also saw how both Isaac and Rebekah took their concerns to God. And he will answer us when we ask in accordance with his will. Matthew 6, verse 9 through 13, Matthew 7, verse 7 through 11, also 1 John 5, verse 14. So when we face difficulties and problems in our life, take those to God. And then the final lesson we'll notice. Being a Christian, being a follower of Jesus Christ, being a follower of God, means submitting our desires, thoughts, and even our bodies to the Lord. Paul wrote in 1 Corinthians 6, verse 13 through 20. Esau serves as a negative example of someone who traded away a wonderful blessing for just a moment of pleasure, a moment of satisfaction. Paul goes further there in 1 Corinthians 6, 13 through 20, and makes the point that our bodies there were not made for sexual immorality. And so no wonder it causes so many problems. We were not made for sexual immorality. That belongs, the Hebrews writer says, in marriage, but not outside of marriage. So those are a couple of lessons from Genesis chapter 25. I appreciate you studying along with me. Lord willing, next week, the scene in Genesis 26 shifts back to Isaac. We've talked briefly about Jacob and Esau, but the scene is going to come back to Isaac for just a little while before moving on from him. But until next time, I hope you have a good rest of your day.